Good morning, Year 11. Today we're going to be looking at a possible question from the strange case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and we'll be going through a walk and talk mock together where I'll be guiding you through the question and how you could plan and write your response to the question. So just have a start by having a look at the exam paper that you have in front of you. It says, read the following extract from Chapter 2, The Search for Mr. Hyde, and then answer the question that follows. Write about how Stevenson presents Utterson in this extract and how Stevenson presents Utterson in the novel as a whole. So this is a character question, but it's always a good idea to just make sure that you're absolutely going to be answering the question by just highlighting the keywords of the question. Just bear with me a moment because I'm just unblocking the screen for my class. So you've highlighted the keywords Utterson, so there's absolutely no doubt you're not going to go astray and start writing about something else. Okay, and it's up to you at this point really whether you want to engage straight away with the extract or just spend a few minutes thinking about Utterson and maybe jotting down the key ideas you have about Utterson. I prefer to go straight into the extract because I find that looking at the extract will then give me some key ideas about the character and help me begin to think about the other points that I want to make about the whole novel. So I'm going to read it through once and then I'm going to read it through twice and start annotating it because it's always a good idea, especially when you have an extract, to read it through twice. From that time forward, Mr. Utterson began to haunt the door in the by-street of the shops. In the morning before office hours, at noon when business was plenty and time scarce, at night under the face of the fogged city moon, by all lights and all hours of solitude or concourse, the lawyer was to be found at his chosen post. If he be Mr. Hyde, he had thought, I shall be Mr. Seek. And at last his patience was rewarded. It was a fine, dry night, frost in the air, the streets as clean as a ballroom, the lamps unshaken by any wind, drawing a regular pattern of light and shadow. By 10 o'clock, when the shops were closed, the by-street was very solitary and, in spite of the low growl of London from all around, very silent. Small sounds carried far, domestic sounds out of the houses were clearly audible on either side of the roadway, and the rumour of the approach of any passenger preceded him by a long time. Mr. Utterson had been some minutes at his post when he was aware of an odd light footstep drawing near. In the course of his nightly patrols he had long grown accustomed to the quaint effect with which the footfalls of a single person, while he is still a great way off, suddenly spring out distinct from the vast hum and clatter of the city. Yet his attention had never before been so sharply and decisively arrested, and it was with a strong superstitious prevision of success that he withdrew into the entry of the court. Okay, so this is that moment where Utterson is now sort of becoming a little bit obsessed with this story of Hyde that he has heard through his friend Enfield. He's realised that there is a connection between Hyde and Jekyll, and he's beginning to cast himself as the role of the detective to try and find out a little bit more, because he's obviously worried by the will, isn't he? Jekyll has made this will leaving everything to Hyde. So let's go through again and start picking out the key quotes that I would want to use. And remember, you really want to make the most of your extract. You know, you've got to do everything else from memory, but in particular those AO2 marks that you're going to get from language analysis. If you're really struggling to remember quotes from the rest of the text, you want to use as many quotes as possible from the extract. So let's have a look first of all. Okay, so I've got, from that time forward, Mr. Utterson began to haunt the door in the by-street. So that's really interesting, isn't it? So I'm going to highlight that one first of all. And then I've noticed that there are interesting time references. So in the morning, at noon, at night. So he's there all the time. And then we have this reference to how he's sort of not even concentrating on his work anymore. You know, he's there when business was plenty. So that's quite significant. the lawyer was to be found at his chosen post. So he's almost sort of sacrificing his work career in order to choose to do this instead. So I'm definitely going to go back and have a really close look at that in a second. Then we've got this wonderful quote, "If he be Mr. Hyde, I shall be Mr. Seek." So I'm definitely going to make use of that. Again, all that time he's spent, you know, it's clearly he's been there a long time, because at last his patience is rewarded. So I'm going to pick out that and come back to that in a second. And then we've got this description of the setting. A lot of this next part of the extract is all to do with the setting. Now that is significant. Utterson is really, really closely linked to this sort of Gothic London setting. So I'm going to pick out some of those sort of more sinister quotes here. So there's that idea of a pattern of light and shadow. The street's very solitary. You've got that wonderful bit where he talks about the growl of London, and even small sounds are clearly audible. Again, this idea of patience, some minutes at his post. So I'm going to pick that out. And then I'm very mindful as I'm looking at this last section that it's Utterson who tells the reader about Hyde pretty much from now on. You know, we don't really see Utterson unless it's through, we don't really see Hyde unless it's through Utterson's eyes. So I'm going to pick out this idea of these odd light footsteps drawing near. Again, nightly patrols, quite interesting, going to pick that out. Vast hum and clatter of the city, going back to that rather menacing description of the city. And then the effect that Hyde has on him, so sharply and decisively arrested. And he has this strong, superstitious prevision of success, and he withdraws into the entry of the court. So those are the quotes that I'm definitely going to focus in on. And so what I want to be making sure that I'm doing now is that I'm really thinking about my assessment objectives. So I want to be thinking about AO1. I've got my quotes, but I need to show I understand them. You know, so what are the ideas that are coming through in these quotes? I need to have my AO2. I need to be talking about my language, don't I? And I need to be getting my terms prepared. And then I've got my AO3, which is my context. And remember, this can be social and historical, so historical or social. It can be to do with the literary context, so it could be a genre or literary context thing, or it could be more tied into the ideas and perspectives of the author. So I've just put a little shorthand there, because so often what happens in exams is, you know, you write brilliantly and you say some lovely things about the question and the characters, but if you lose your focus on the assessment objectives, then you're just not getting the marks. So right from the word go, I need to be looking at this extract, and I need to be thinking, you know, how can I maximize the marks that I'm getting? Okay, so let's have a look then. So from that time forward, all of these references, these time references there that show that Utterson is spending, you know, all of this time. So I'm going to connect time to morning, night and noon. So there's a definite build-up of a sort of semantic field of time, showing that he's sort of devoting to this hunt. For Hyde, you know, he's spending all his time. Like this triadic structure as well. You might call it a triplet or a pattern of three, but we've got this triadic structure that really emphasizes that he's spending, you know, all day. Yeah.
Is there any chance you could move it a bit closer?
Oh, I can have a go. Is that any better? That's just probably as big as it's going to get. There's some seats a bit closer to the front. You could jump into Harvey's seat if you wanted to. So I've got my triadic structure that's really emphasizing, you know, that he's spending all day there as well. Now, in particular, when business was plenty, okay, so he's clearly losing out on profit and work. If you remember, in chapter 1, he was introduced to us as the lawyer, and he was dry and dusty. You know, there was nothing particularly interesting about him. He just seemed to have no outside interests other than, you know, work and his small circle of friends. But it really shows that his behaviour has changed, you know, quite dramatically. Now he's forsaking his lawyer career, his business work, and he's spending all of this time, especially at night. You know, this was quite a dry, dusty man who would sit and read his Bible on a Sunday night, and, you know, didn't really get the sense that he would go out very much. I didn't pick this out, but I think that's quite interesting. Now I'm following this chain of thought, you know, that at night in this, you know, fairly isolated, beginning to be quite gothic setting, he is alone. And if you consider, you know, what he knows about Hyde, he knows he's violent, he knows that he's trampled on this child, he knows that when people see him they have this really strange reaction to him and want to sort of tear him apart. So, you know, it's really creating that sense of tension. He's clearly putting himself at some risk, skulking about in these you know, by streets, because they're not busy streets. They're, you know, these sort of the back alleys where fewer people frequent them. So that's making me think that even though he hasn't met Hyde yet, it's sort of the effect of Hyde, isn't it? That he hasn't even met him, but already he's, you know, really sort of focused and intrigued by him. There's something about Hyde that is, you know, niggling, and he won't let it go. It's becoming a real obsession. Right, okay, so I've had a really good look at that. I'm just thinking AO2 language terms. I've talked about the triadic circle, the semantic field. I could talk maybe about the visual imagery of the fogged city moon, just sort of lifting the amount of language terms I'm using there. What about AO3 then? In terms of AO3, haven't really addressed that as much as I would like to. So I'm going to go back to this point about him being the dry and dusty lawyer. I'm going to maybe think about this idea of the Victorian gentleman. You know, at first he seems to be this archetypal, you know, Victorian gentleman who is the height of respectability, and now he seems to be doing quite strange things. And here I've mentioned the Gothic. Now that will link to my AO3 in terms of genre. So we know that Stevenson makes, you know, frequent and very effective use of Gothic features in this novel. It's that strange hybrid of, is it a Gothic novel? Is it a detective novel? Is it a science fiction novel? Okay, so then I've just mentioned that word detective, and that's what's happening here. If he should be Mr. Hyde, I shall be Mr. Seek. Haha. So we have that, you know, pun there on Hyde and Seek, as if, you know, Hyde is something disguised, something secretive. You know, he's hidden his reasons for his relationship with Jekyll. It needs investigating. And we have that first sort of inkling of Utterson as a detective. Okay, so, you know, there's the scope to do a lot of work with that. He's taking on the role of the detective in this story. And there's some really interesting language choices as we go through to think about that. The word post is repeated twice, I believe. Let me just find the other one. I'm fairly sure it's in there, I just can't see it at the moment. But we've got the alliteration of post and patrols. We could maybe even bring in, you know, this idea of his patience. And that's quite interesting, isn't it? Because patrol, you immediately sort of associate that with maybe a policeman out on a patrol, or maybe even a soldier. You know, somebody who has some sort of duty to protect. So that's quite interesting that Utterson, you know, this previously uninteresting character is now sort of taken on this quite significant duty to protect and serve, and in his eyes he's sort of protecting and serving Jekyll. Now that becomes quite interesting later, and I'll talk about that a little bit later, but that leads me to start thinking about Utterson as maybe not being as completely respectable and, you know, upstanding as he appears to be. And so it's this bit I'm interested in here, these patterns of light and shadow, because although that fits into, you know, idea of the Gothic setting, you know, that's quite a eerie effect that's being created there, flickering lights and shadows. You've also got that idea, and I'm going to bring it over here, of duality, which is one of the core themes of the story, isn't it? You know, that is the central theme, that we are this mingled sort of entity. There's nothing straightforward about us. We are good and we are evil. And in terms of AO3 then, maybe I could bring in a bit of Freudian theory there, because he was talking about those sort of layers of personality, wasn't he? The consciousness, the unconsciousness, the ego and the id. So, you know, nobody is straightforward as they appear. And also we could bring in this idea of Victorian hypocrisy, because although Utterson appears to be this upstanding gentleman, when you think about it, what he's doing here is this sort of sinister and, I wouldn't say criminal, but certainly unsettling as what Hyde does. So you've got this strange language of he's haunting the door there, and, you know, essentially he's sort of hiding and waiting to pounce on Hyde. He withdrew into the entry of the court, so his behaviour is as sort of peculiar and secretive and unsettling as, you know, we could say Jekyll's is or Hyde's is. And obviously later on, and I'll just mention this now, or I'll talk about it a bit more later, we realise that Utterson is a hypocrite, isn't he? He is quite willing to use his skills as a lawyer, not to defend, you know, right and wrong, to be unbiased, but to get Jekyll out of any trouble that he's in. So he clearly has suspicions about, you know, possible misdeeds that Jekyll might have committed, and all the time we have this idea that, you know, he will blackmail Hyde in return. He will use his skills as a lawyer to get Jekyll off the hook, which, you know, is that idea of hypocrisy there. Sorry if I've gone off on a bit of a tangent there. Right, where were we? We were talking about, oh yeah, him being the sort of the detective then out on patrol, but the flip side of that is his behaviour is also, you know, quite sinister. Okay, then what have we got? These are the bits that we talked about, the Gothic setting again. So although I've mentioned it a little bit there, there's some lovely language devices that you can use here. So obviously you've got the growl of London all around and the vast hum and clatter of the city. So I can link both of those things together and do some really good AO2 work there, because obviously we've got some really strong auditory imagery. And also with that growl, we've got this sort of metaphor beginning to creep in. Growl, you immediately think of some sort of predator, some sort of, you know, threat. And that really ties into, you know, that AO3 idea of urban terror. That the city has rapidly increased in terms of size and population. It is now a sort of hub of crime and disease, whereas Gothic novels used to focus on exotic locations, exotic foreign locations, you know, possibly rural and isolated, you know, Wuthering Heights, Yorkshire Moors, Northanger Abbey, that sort of thing. As the 19th century moves towards its end with the fin de siècle, the urban area becomes the site of the terror, the city. So for Jekyll and Hyde and you know, novels like Picture of Dorian Gray, you know, the city is the threat. So you have all of that going on here. Oh, there's my other post. I knew there were 2 posts there. Look, so I can add post is repeated twice. I knew it was lurking there somewhere. So thinking about that idea of, you know, very solitary streets, the growl of London, the noisy threats there, and we talked about the shadows as well, didn't we? And then the final thing that I would bring out of this is we are seeing Hyde through Utterson. You know, the only sort of version we get of Hyde is through other characters until we have that final revelation through Jekyll's confession at the end. So it's quite interesting, isn't it, that straight away what we hear of him is an odd light footstep drawing near. And again, I can start linking that to what happens in the rest of the novel. So odd would, you know, suggest to me that it's very strange, very unusual, and light might suggest that he is, you know, small and not weighing very much, or that he's, you know, deliberately being stealthy. So this all goes back to this idea of Darwinian theory, doesn't it? It's being introduced here, that somehow Jekyll is a throwback to our ancestors. You know, he's smaller, he's dwarfish, and that's being introduced here. You've also got this lovely sibilance at the end that creates this very sinister effect. We know later on when they do come face to face, Hyde hisses at him, doesn't he, like an animal. So you've got that lovely sibilance beginning to creep in here, that sort of hissing sibilance. And what could we do with that? Maybe we could bring in the idea of the biblical context, the idea that you had sort of science versus religion coming here, so that hissing sound might remind us of the serpent in the Garden of Eden, and that story was all about knowledge, wasn't it? Adam and Eve took the fruit from the tree of knowledge, and Jekyll is doing exactly the same thing with his experiments. He has gained a knowledge that perhaps, you know, should have remained secret. Those sort of yeah, there's real secrets about, you know, what human beings are. If we are made in the image of God, then we shouldn't try and break that down. We shouldn't try and untangle that, should we? And there were lots of people at the time who felt very strongly that, you know, these new scientific investigations, people beginning to understand, you know, the first blood transfusions, that was going too far. It was tampering with God's work. And many Gothic novels, you know, Frankenstein also deals with that idea of human knowledge going too far and there being a consequence. Remember at the end of the novel, Jekyll says, you know, what happens to him, he doesn't care about it. I can't remember the exact words now, but he says something like, it's up to another to decide. And there's that sense of, is he talking about Hyde, or is he talking about God? Is he talking about Judgment Day, where somebody will make a judgment about him? So let's just spot check. I've got a really good range of ideas. I'm definitely okay for ideas. In terms of AO3 then, we've got lots of stuff in terms of literary context. We've got the detective and the Gothic genre. We've got that idea about the respectable Victorian gentleman and hypocrisy. We've got science versus religion. I think we're absolutely fine on that. And then in terms of AO2, we've definitely got a wide range of language terms that we could begin to talk about. So that's looking really good. It's a bit of a mess though, so what I thought I would do is just break it down for you in a clearer, tight way, so that you can see how I would respond to this particular extract then. So these are the points that I would make, and I've just jotted them down in note form. I just think it's really handy to sort of splurge all your ideas and then to think, okay, well, I'm aiming to make 3 or 4 points on the extract. So I would start off by talking about Utterson as the detective, and I would talk about how Stevenson is manipulating genre in this extract. So you know, we have this this use of the detective genre. So just very briefly, we talked about Post. You know, he's taken on a completely different job, if you like. He has this sense of duty and commitment to this new role as detective. We've got the hide and seek pun. We've got this idea of, you know, is he just being patient or is it obsessive now? You know, he's there all hours. I would bring in the fact that, you know, Stevenson is using Utterson as a way of revealing. I put Jekyll there. I meant Hyde. Sorry. Hyde, you know, we see Hyde through Utterson's eyes and ears, because it's the sound of him we have first, which is, you know, immediately quite significant. I bring in this idea of duality. Yes, he's a lawyer. Yes, he's a respectable gentleman, but his behaviour here is quite sinister as well. And I would also begin to build in this idea that throughout the novel, Utterson has this really strong connection with the Gothic elements of the novel. You know, we see him several times in very Gothic settings, and I suppose that begins to develop the, you know, the fear in the novel, doesn't it, through Utterson's experiences. So I'm good to go. I am ready to write some really interesting paragraphs. So again, I've done the first paragraph for you, and I've typed it up because you can probably tell that my handwriting at times is rather incomprehensible. So let's have a look at this paragraph, and then you're going to have a go at writing your own paragraph on one of those other structures, other points I've planned. Okay, and we're going to break down and try and figure out why this is such a good paragraph. Okay. Utterson is central to Stevenson's manipulation of the detective genre in the novel Jekyll and Hyde. This genre was growing increasingly popular with the publication of the first Sherlock Holmes story in 1886, the same year as Jekyll and Hyde. Initially, Stevenson deliberately misleads the reader in expecting the novel to be a fairly straightforward crime story, employing Utterson as the detective. After hearing the story of the injured child and suspecting Hyde of blackmailing his friend, Utterson takes on the role of the detective, determined to solve the case. In this extract, Stevenson's use of alliteration emphasises his post and patrols. Here, the almost military language suggests Utterson is taking his role very seriously. This is combined with a triadic structure of morning, afternoon and night, showing that Utterson spends all his available time watching and waiting for an opportunity to confront Hyde. Earlier in Chapter 1, the reader was introduced to Hyde as a successful lawyer, and yet now he's spending all hours on this case, particularly when business was plenty and time scarce. These repeated references to time perhaps leaves the reader wondering if his behaviour has gone beyond a sense of loyalty and duty to his friend and has become some sort of obsession. Okay, so why is that a good paragraph? It is a good paragraph because I have made really good use of my evidence. I'm using short embedded quotes. I'm using ellipses to sort of reduce quotes to the bits that I need. So in total there, I've used a really good range of quotes. And, you know, just thinking about AO2 then, so there's my quotes, there's my AO1. I've talked about the military language. I've talked about the triadic structure. I have talked about repeated references to time and the alliteration. So I've got a wide range of AO2 terms that I'm using to explore my quotes. And then obviously at the beginning, I've chosen to start this particular paragraph with a bit of AO3. And so my focus is on this idea of the literary context and Stevenson's manipulation of the detective genre. And I've got my little fact in there as well to back that up. I've referenced the Sherlock Holmes story being published on the same date. So that is a very successful paragraph then. Okay, so it's over to you now. Have one final look at that paragraph and think about why that's doing a really good job. And then go back to my, and it's a very, you know, it's a plan that's written in very much in note form. So I've done that one. We can tick that one off, and that leaves you to choose one of these three. So would you like to write for 10 minutes about Utterson's role in revealing and developing Hyde for the audience, or would you like to write about the fact that even, you know, the lawyer here is being used to explore that idea of duality? There's something quite sinister about his behaviour. Or would you like to explore Utterson's connection with the Gothic setting, that other literary genre that Stevenson uses so well? Okay, so it's down to you which one you want to write about, and I'm going to give you 10 minutes to write a paragraph. Okay, off you go. Okay, so you've had 10 minutes to write your paragraph, and what I'd like you to do now is annotate it in the same way that I did mine. So start off by just reassuring yourself that you have used a wide range of evidence from the extract, and remember again that because you've got to do the rest from memory, you know, this is your best way to get those marks for AO1 and AO2. So just highlight or underline any quotes that you've used, asking yourself, are they short and embedded? Have you used that ellipsis technique in any of them to reduce them down and condense them to what you need? Have you synthesized them? Are they quotes from different parts of the text that you're using to bring together to prove, you know, that same point? And then next off, think about your AO2, think about your language terms, highlight in a different colour if you can, or underline any of the language devices that you've referred to. Okay, and then finally, did you manage to bring in some AO3? It could be anywhere in your paragraph. It might be your starting point. It might be something that you link to a quote later on. But were you able to bring in some context in terms of the writer Stevenson's ideas and perspectives, social and historical context, or that idea of literary context? So talked about Gothic or the biblical, that would give you the marks for literary context. Okay, right, good stuff. So you're aiming then to work really closely with the extract and to try, like I said, to make 3 or 4 points about the extract. But remember that the question asks you to think about the novel as a whole as well. How does Stevenson present Utterson in the novel as a whole? And you could make, you know, any range of points you wanted to that you think are relevant. It's just the way that my brain works. I like to have things very neat and tidy when I'm writing in terms of the organisation, not the presentation, obviously. But I like to link my points. You don't have to, they can be completely separate points. So when I started to think about this idea of the detective, it just makes me think, well, where else in the novel does Utterson behave, you know, like a detective? He takes on this role all the way through, doesn't he? And especially towards the end of the novel, and always try and make a point about the end of the novel, because students tend to, for some reason, only write about the first half and not really focus on the end. But that dramatic final climax in the last night, where he's breaking doors down and he's, you know, revealing truths, that seems to be the, you know, the conclusion of this idea of Utterson as a detective. But the interesting thing is, you know, he doesn't, does he? He as a detective, he isn't able to uncover, you know, the crime and what exactly has been happening. We have to wait another 2 chapters until Jekyll does that. And in my head, that's linked to the structure of the novel as well, the chapter titles and the epistolary form of all these documents and secrets. This idea of duality, you know, he beginning to seem in this extract as sinister as Hyde is. Again, that continues later on, doesn't he? The reason he's doing this is because he wants to find out about Hyde so that he can blackmail him in return. So he's a lawyer that's trying to find evidence for blackmail. And again, when he suspects that Jekyll's done something wrong, you know, he wants to get him out of it. So we've got that idea of duality and hypocrisy. We've also got this idea of when, you know, Utterson reveals Jekyll for us, and then finally this idea of the Gothic connection, you know, several times in the novel. So I've just put those points side by side so you can see my whole plan then. So obviously I would spend my first sort of half of my time, about half an hour, writing about the extract. But then in the remaining time that I have, this is very ambitious. I might not be able to make all of these points, but I've been able to sort of springboard from the extract to the rest of the novel. Okay, and it's absolutely fine if you have just different ideas, you know, completely different ideas that weren't established in the extract. That's fine too. It's just the way my brain works. So like I said, I could talk about his role as the detective later on in the novel. I could talk about, and these are the quotes that I've just written down from chapter 2. You know, he's hardly human, he's pale and dwarfish and deformed. This comes immediately after the extract. So we've got all of that wonderful language that has Hyde as the, you know, the Darwinian precursor to our civilized human selves. This is the bit later on in sort of, again, in chapter 2 and chapter 3, where his behaviour becomes very questionable as a lawyer. So he's got that idea of duality coming in. You know, they both agree, this is quite interesting, in chapter 1 they both agree, you know, not to ask questions. It's a good rule, and Utterson and Enfield say, not to ask questions. But then immediately Utterson breaks that sort of promise. You know, he says, oh, with all my heart, he's never going to refer to it again. But that evening he's out on his patrol looking for Hyde. So, you know, he's broken his promise to his closest friend. And then of course, you know, he begins to suspect this sort of blackmail plot that is probably linked to some sort of homosexual relationship between Hyde and Jekyll at some point. I'm a man to be trusted, I'll get you out of it, you know, is loaded with hypocrisy there. And again, this connection with the Gothic, you know, in the Carey murder case, when he goes with the police to try and find Hyde, and the last night when he goes to Jekyll's house to break down the door and find out what's been going on, we both have these, you know, really strong Gothic settings that create that sense of mystery and fear. So what would a paragraph look like then? I've developed my paragraph that is linked to the detective, the role of the detective. So I'm immediately making a link in this paragraph. Utterson's role as the detective in the crime novel is further emphasised, so I'm making that link, through Stevenson's use of the epistolary form, making use of letters and other documents, and particularly through the chapter titles. These employ the semantic field of criminal investigations: search, murder case, incident. Indeed, incident is repeated twice and suggests an unusual event, particularly or a violent disturbance. In The Last Night, Utterson reaches the climax of his investigation as he dramatically breaks down the door to Jekyll's laboratory in a final attempt to solve the mystery and unmask Hyde. Poole speaks of his suspicion of foul play. Utterson presumes he has solved the case. I think I begin to see the light. There's my explanation. The metaphor light suggests Utterson thinks he's driven back all doubt and shadows. However, Stevenson's manipulation of the genre means the reader isn't given a satisfying conclusion at this point. There are 2 more chapters to come. Again, Utterson is left unravelling more mysteries with a packet of sealed documents. Okay, so once again, I'm trying to make sure I do the same things. So I've made the link. I've got a clear link between the extract and the whole text. Okay, and I've got my quotes, so you know, I've had to remember these, and you can do some really nice work with the chapter titles. It's quite easy to remember them. So I've got my evidence there, good range of evidence that I've been able to remember, and I've got my language terms in again. So I'm talking about mainly the structure of the novel here, but this would still count as AO2. So I've talked about the climax, I've talked about the epistolary form, I've talked about the semantic field, the metaphor. I've explored this quote in lots of detail about how the metaphor light suggests, you know, driving back the shadows, but that never happens. Oh, I've talked about repetition there as well. So there's a really good emphasis on AO2 again in this paragraph. In terms of AO3, it's a little bit weak. I suppose literary context, I've talked about the epistolary form, that hopefully would count as a little bit of AO3 there. But perhaps it's not as strong as I would like it. You know, aim to have AO3 frequently in your essays. Sometimes it just doesn't quite fit with the point that you're making. So you are going to have a go now in the final 10 minutes at writing a paragraph about the rest of the novel. And it's up to you if you would like to use my plan, you know, especially maybe this idea of later on in chapter 2, Jekyll is revealed through Utterson. You've got that nice range of quotes there that you could use if you haven't quite done your revision and got all your quotes in your head yet. Or, of course, there's some good quotes here as well, where you could talk about how, you know, the theme of duality is brought in through this lawyer as well, because there's some good quotes in there. Okay, so 10 minutes on the clock, and you are going to have a go at writing a paragraph about the rest of the novel. Off you go, 10 minutes. So well done for completing your paragraph on the rest of the novel. And before we finish then, it might be a good idea to just go back to that paragraph and see if you can do a similar thing again, just to prove to yourself that you're on the right lines. You've highlighted the quotes that you've used, you've picked out the language terms that you've used. If you were able to link it to an AO3 point, then make a note of that as well. And just think about I think more than ever, it's the point that you make is really important here. You know, how you're very definitely linking it to the rest of the text. So you're either making a link or you're introducing a completely new point. So that idea of, you know, later in the novel, further in the novel, at the end of the novel, just making it very clear that you're talking about the rest of the novel. So, final key points then. Work with the extract. Very, very frustrating when you, as a teacher, English teacher, get some work back to mark and there's just no annotation of the extract at all. This is your springboard to really getting a wide range of interesting ideas, making sure that you've focused on the assessment objectives. And remember, especially if you're struggling to remember quotes from the rest of the text, you think of how much green is highlighted here. I'm going to be quoting about a minimum of 2/3, you know, getting on for a half of the extract. I'm going to be using that as direct quotes, aren't I? Making sure that you're really focusing on your AO2 with the extract, you're picking out your language terms, and, you know, don't forget good old AO3, trying to make some good linked AO3 points. And then, you know, spending that time on a rough sort of plan. I think that, you know, this planning is probably a bit too detailed because I've done it for your benefit. But, you know, I would definitely have, you know, some sort of T structure plan where I think, you know, this is what I'm going to say about the extract. And then either my direct links to the rest of the text or perhaps completely new ideas, you know, elsewhere in the novel something very different is done. I can have that as a very different idea. Again, perhaps an unrealistic plan. Could I make all of these points under time conditions? Probably not. So maybe even think about planning in, you know, rank order. So you definitely do the ones that you think are most interesting, so that you get those down. And if time allows, you might be able to pick up, you know, the less significant ones. You know, Utterson's connection with the Gothic setting. I could probably maybe abandon that because I've done a lot of really good work on genre there. Maybe even I could bring those ideas about the Gothic, you know, if I was running out of time, I could mention it briefly here, couldn't I, to think about his sinister behaviour. So make a plan, but be flexible with your plan. Okay, all the very best of luck in the real thing.